Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we challenge some of the many assumptions of today and where we dare to think the unthinkable, where we ask fundamental causal questions. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we're going to look again at this issue of cancer, how to avoid it and perhaps how to treat it. And it's a great pleasure to welcome back to the show Professor Thomas Seyfried of Boston College, Massachusetts in the United States. Professor Seyfried, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and once again a very warm welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel. It's nice to be back on your show. Thanks.
Fantastic. There have been a number of questions, Professor, since our last conversation, which I think very well summarised. You made it very clear the essence of your presentation, your interpretation of the evidence, painting this picture of cancer as a metabolic disease, as opposed to the conventional doctrine, I'm going to call it, the dogma of the genetic disease. But people have had various questions and they're asking for some clarification on a couple of issues. So thank you very much for coming back to address a few of these. So I won't introduce you more than that. We've done it all before on the previous show and that'll be linked too. So let's dive straight in. One gentleman wanted to question. He says he's on day 20 of an extended water fast and his glucose is 91, his ketones were measuring 5.8, so he calculated his GKI as 0.87. And he said that according to you, he'd be in therapeutic ketosis. And his question is, how can cancer starve when he has a glucose of 91?
Yeah, well, the issue is that, it's a good question. And the answer is they don't starve. They stop growing. And many of them die, but not all of them. Don't forget, the tumor cells need a large amount of glucose to survive, much larger than the amount needed for normal cells. So keeping his blood sugar and ketones in the state of therapeutic ketosis means that his normal cells are also competing for that glucose with the tumor cells. So people shouldn't think, I need to get down, like I said, 65 to 75 milligrams per deciliter. What happens is after the body adjusts, the issue of gluconeogenesis becomes quite efficient, where the body will take other sources and fuels and maintain a steady glucose level. Now, what we recommend for cancer patients is once they're in the state of therapeutic ketosis, we can use other drugs or insulin to force down those sugars really, really low without compromising integrity, cognitive integrity, let's put it that way. So there are reports in the literature with individuals very similar to what the gentleman who asked the question. Once they were in ketosis for about 2 weeks with water only, they were given high doses of insulin. And that brought their sugars down to 0.5 millimolar, which is 9 milligrams per deciliter, if you can believe this, without any cognitive decline at all, because the ketones were replacing the glucose.
Right. Because you could lose consciousness, couldn't you, if your blood sugar went too low, if you're not prepared with the ketones. Is that correct?
Yeah, it could kill you.
Yeah.
But when you're in therapeutic ketosis only prepares your body for allowing us to push blood sugars down really, really low.
Okay.
Therapeutic ketosis alone it's just a platform for the other therapies. It's not designed to eliminate all your tumor cells.
Okay. Well, I guess that it does help clarify, because obviously there's a lot of, and it's a theme that I've noticed from the questions, there's a lot of people out there trying to help themselves directly, as you can appreciate.
Yeah.
And something they can do is a ketogenic diet. Obviously, these other therapeutic things that you've mentioned, for clarity, they obviously need some level of care and assistance in achieving those measures.
Yeah, well, I think people sometimes think they can do everything themselves, and they can't. What they can do at home is certainly bring themselves, like this gentleman certainly brought himself into a wonderful state of therapeutic ketosis. Now, if he were to go back to a knowledgeable oncologist, the oncologist would say, great, my patient is now ready for the other stages of the therapy, which would include drugs that or other procedures that would push blood sugars down really low without causing any harm to the patient because he is already in therapeutic ketosis. And then we would use hyperbaric oxygen and we would use other kinds of things. And that would certainly put much, much greater pressure on the tumor cells.
Okay,
so he's in stage 1 of the therapy, basically.
Okay, so a key point there is he would need to find a knowledgeable oncologist, and that's probably a key point to note. You mentioned hyperbaric oxygen, which is another question a little bit further down the tracks, but perhaps I can just stick with ketosis. Somebody mentioned they have an estrogen or estrogen-driven cancer, though they didn't elaborate, and they're taking drugs to stop estrogen. Is ketogenic diet, is it potentially equally as effective for them?
It should be, because all the tumor cells need glucose, regardless of what their hormonal phenotype happens to be. They're still going to be fermenters.
Okay.
So, and some of those drugs that target the receptors also lower blood sugar.
Yeah.
So, but the patient, if they're concerned, they should, if they're in therapeutic ketosis, and then take the drug. And if the drug makes them fall out of therapeutic ketosis, then I would be concerned about the drug.
Right. Yes.
Because as I said, people say, well, this drug, that drug, the cell still needs to ferment. I mean, so I don't care what kind of cancer it is. It's going to require some level of fermentation, which is glucose and glutamine. It's a little harder to do the glutamine, but we're working on that now. But still, pushing the blood sugars down is a good way to manage the disease. But you also have to ask now, if the drugs that are used to target the receptor, the hormone receptor, do not alter blood sugar, then it should be fine to take that.
Wonderful. Here's another couple of quick ones. Does a tumor have to be in remission for fasting and ketogenic diet to have an effect? They've written to work. I mean, implying to eradicate the cancer. But is there going to be some benefit, or does the tumor already have to be weakened? I think I know the answer to this one.
No, I think it. If you have a tumor in remission, and you still have evidence that the tumor is alive, or not dead, let's put it that way, because sometimes you can get a lot of necrosis on imaging and things like this, and you don't know if the tumor cells are alive or dead. So it's going to be. But if you have evidence, no, keep the pressure on until you're fairly comfortable. Until you're fairly comfortable that this thing is no longer a threat.
Okay. Somebody asked also, can you fast away a myoma, which I believe is something, a growth from actual muscle tissue? Is it? Maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah. Well, again, I don't know if you can fast away. I mean, to fast away tumors is really Herculean. People that do that from the people who have contacted me and said, or sometimes they're physicians and they'll say to me, I've had a patient fast away his tumor. But usually it's 30 days or more of just water only. I mean, these are Herculean kinds of experiences.
Fasting for the advanced, that is, isn't it?
I mean, you got to be careful here. I mean, some of these, I know people from Vietnam. They told me a physician there had 3 people with advanced metastatic breast cancer and 1 with a pancreatic tumor, and they fasted for over 30 days, water only, and were able to eliminate. I don't know how common that would be. I mean, there's not a lot of people who would go to the physician and he would say, come back in 30 days after you've consumed water only, right? We'll see how you're doing, right? That in Western societies.
Indeed, I agree with you. But at least in if in theory it can bring some benefits, that may
but
that may be meaningful for some people.
Yeah, I don't think most people on the planet can do that. And I think it's better to do the therapeutic fasting, ketogenic diets in combination with drugs that work together with that.
Absolutely.
And that you want to make it so it's not so incredibly hard to do, like fasting for 30 days. I mean, in my mind, I couldn't do that. I mean, but of course, if if my ass were on the line, I probably would. If somebody told me that's the only way to save yourself, maybe I would do that. But
Yeah. Well,
I always ask, do you have anything else for me that I can do besides that?
absolutely. Well, it's good to to hammer home this point then that finding a suitable oncologist and perhaps again perhaps we can elaborate a little bit more on your press pulse thing, with the drugs and deal with it in a way so it's not just, you don't have to be a castaway in the desert on your own, just dealing with it through fasting.
You'd like to have some people that you can touch base with, and unfortunately, the biggest problem, I don't know if the biggest, certainly one of the largest problems, is finding suitable oncologists.
Indeed.
Whether in the UK or in the United States or Germany, I don't care where it is, they just don't know about this. Yeah. So finding the kind of person to help people, guide them through the process is very it's very hard to find the right kind of person.
Indeed. One last question around fasting and ketosis. One listener has written to say that given what we've said about ketosis and fasting, etc., all of it in our previous conversation, which is linked to below, is there any actual evidence that communities of religious fasters, do you see a statistical relevance, if you like? For example, the questioner mentioned Ramadan. I'm not sure that Ramadan is a strictly speaking ketogenic kind of fast. I don't think it would achieve the same. But not to knock Ramadan, but do you get the gist of the question? Is there any evidence among the religious communities?
Well, it's an interesting question because all major religions incorporate some sort of fasting as part of the sacrifice. But in Western, I would say most modern societies have drifted far away from the original intent of these kinds of things. And, you raised the issue of Ramadan. Well, because I had a student who practiced from Egypt, rigorously Ramadan, and what I said, what did you do? And she says, well, we have to eat before the sunrise and we can't eat at all until sundown. But when you calculate the number of calories consumed before the sun came up, after it went down, it was more than if you had eaten during the day. Yeah. So clearly that plan, that strategy is counterproductive.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the Bible with Christ, at least 40 days and 40 nights in the desert or wherever. This is about as long as a young, a 30-year-old man who is not obese would do before they would enter into the field of starvation. And we know that from the Irish guys that in Northern Ireland, Bobby Sands and his group, where they starved themselves. Those guys were alive up to 60, 70, and 80 days with water only before they entered into starvation. So clearly, fasting is very different from starvation. Yeah. Fasting is a therapeutic state. Starvation is a pathological state, and the threshold between fasting and starvation can vary from one person to the next depending upon the amount of body fat store you have. So this is a very wide range of a broad range of demarcations between fasting and starvation.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. Most religions, if people followed their religion the way it was written thousands of years ago, they might be able to get into therapeutic ketosis. But if they follow, watered down versions of these kinds of things, it's unlikely that they will.
Yeah. Okay. Another listener says that given that cancer feeds on acid, should I be on an alkaline keto diet? And maybe we could tie this in with address that one. She goes on actually, but any merit in an alkaline keto diet?
Well, first of all, I don't think cancer cells feed on acid. That's a misnomer. They feed on the glutamine and glucose. So the acid, we tried that. We gave them. What is it? What is the sodium hydride? What is the baking soda?
Bicarbonate of soda. Bicarbonate of soda.
Yeah, sodium bicarbonate. I don't know why.
Sodium bicarbonate.
Yeah. So one of my students said, "Let's try it on the metastatic cancer." We gave them. Excuse me, it didn't do anything.
Okay.
the body maintains a very tight pH, acidity and alkalinity in our blood is so maintained very tight because enzymes and physiology doesn't work if you're outside the physiological zones.
Yeah. So there's very little movement there.
Trying to jack up your body with alkaline. No, your body adjusts everything.
Yep.
You're going to be adjusted within a range, and if you're not, you're going to be one hurting buckaroo. So you don't want to be doing that. None of this stuff. The only thing that the main thing driving the tumor cells is glucose and glutamine, and if you take those away, the tumor cells cannot survive. But very few people are doing this. There's I don't know of any clinics that are doing this.
Sure. So the second part of this lady's question is how can I limit glutamate? She calls it. Maybe she means glutamine.
Glutamine.
She says there are lots of cancer-fighting foods that have glutamate (brackets glutamine) in, such as broccoli. She says, should I avoid these?
No. You can't. The diet, you cannot. Glutamine is a non-essential amino acid, meaning the body can make it if it needs it.
Right.
The muscles are loaded with glutamine. You can't. There's no diet that will restrict. You need drugs.
Yeah.
Drugs are what you're going to need.
Thank you for clarifying that, and that's really where we were going with that. And so, if it's drugs, are we back to the same question of needing to find this, mythical oncologist out there who knows and can prescribe them? Can you perhaps at least remind us what the drugs are that you use to target glutamine? And let's just clarify, not glutamate, but glutamine.
Yeah, well, I mean, what happens is glutamine is metabolized to glutamate. Glutamate is then metabolized to alpha ketoglutarate, and I don't want to get into but then to succinyl-CoA and succinate, and that generates tremendous amounts of ATP energy for the tumor cells, and that's actually the missing link in Warburg's theory, which we just identified.
Okay.
But besides glucose, they use the glutamine. Now you can get glutamine, from the body. You can make it from glucose. It's released from the muscles. But we're not sure. The glutamine that drives the tumor is localized right in the microenvironment of the tumor. So we're not sure systemically how effective that would be. However, for blood cancers, which are also sucking down glutamine, like the whole range of various lymphomas and these kinds of tumors, I mean, you could use, phenylbutyrate, which is then metabolized to phenylacetate, which binds to glutamine, and then you eliminate it in the urine. You just pee it out. But for solid tumors, you would need to use other kinds of drugs that would get to the microenvironment. And then these drugs must be pulsed very strategically because they will, if not used correctly and knowledgeably, they could damage and harm our immune system because the immune cells of our immune system also need the same molecule to do their job.
Right.
So if we're too aggressive in targeting glutamine, we would also target our normal immune cells, which we need to clean up the mess.
Yes.
So again, this is part of the press pulse therapeutic strategy that we developed. So you'll have to I'll find oncologists that are intimately familiar with the metabolism of cancer cells and know how to press and pulse the different strategies off each other. And this again comes back to the massive lack of knowledge on the part of the oncology community worldwide on how to do any of this stuff. Okay. So this leaves the poor patient without a guiding hand. And so I think retraining oncologists would be a number one priority if one wants to move into the sphere of metabolic therapy for cancer.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for clarifying that. I mean, I understood from our previous conversation that, as you mentioned, glutamine is an important a tool of the immune system, and this is why you have to target it very specifically, and then not target it and target it again. Hence your pulse therapy.
Yeah, because both the cancer cell and the normal immune cells need the same fuel to do their job. One is used to survive, and the other guy needs it to do his job.
Yeah.
So if you want to try to kill the tumor cell, you're also paralyzing the very cell that you need to do its job to get rid of the dead tumor cells.
Yeah.
So you need to know how to do all this, and there's a reason for doing it, and there's a clear strategy for doing it. The problem is that there's very few people trained, and I don't recommend cancer patients trying to do this on their own. I mean, this is nuts. Why would, it's just like, and that's the big lack of problem we have. We don't have people trained.
Okay, so I mean, the solution that we're being steered to then is really we need to spread the word and try and apply pressure and get, cancer properly redefined as a metabolic disease as opposed to a genetic disease. So there's something indirect people can do, but obviously it doesn't help, any cancer sufferers in the short term.
No, and I think in the United States we're starting to consider building these kinds of facilities. Where you would have a knowledgeable base of people and procedures available all under the same roof that would be able to take the cancer patient from point A to point Z and allow that person to eliminate their tumor, working with a group of knowledgeable oncologists, physicians, nutritionists, and these kinds of people. You need to have a team.
Yeah.
So. We don't want to pass the cancer patient. He goes in now, he gets diagnosed by some general practitioner. Then he goes off to the radiation guy. Then he goes off to the chemo guy. Then he goes to the surgeon guy. He's like passed around from one group to the next. And then they you got to have a team that follows the same guy through all of and they're there from the beginning to the end to help this guy. So, this is the way it has to work. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have this problem getting worse and worse each year. Another
listener mentions glutamine blockers, but you kind of said enough to perhaps answer that. But and also another mentioned the drug DON, which I think you might have mentioned briefly in our previous chat. Can you talk to the idea of glutamine blockers?
Okay, glutamine blockers are different than phenylacetate. Phenylbutyrate will just allow glutamine to be excreted, so it doesn't block it. It just kind of eliminates the availability in the blood. Glutamine inside solid tissues, you're going to need drugs that actually stop the pathway of glutaminolysis, which ultimately allows the tumor cell to make ATP. So there are a variety of drugs that are under clinical evaluation, and some drugs that have been used in the past, which were sometimes found to be too toxic when used alone. However, when used with ketogenic diets or other kinds of strategies, the toxicity of these drugs can be significantly reduced, which is almost like having a new drug itself.
Yeah.
So, the question is, are the drugs available to people? They usually have to be delivered intravenously, so you have to have someone that knows how to do this. People can't do this on their own.
No.
So, which blockers work best under which conditions? This all has to be worked out. The pharmaceutical companies are certainly very interested in glutamine blockers. Whether they will find a drug as powerful as DON, 6,5-dioxynoreleucine, it's not clear because that drug is, to me, the most powerful I've seen, and maybe others will be found, but I don't know. But if you have drugs that already are known to work and you know how to reduce their toxicity and you know how to use them effectively with a more complete therapeutic strategy, then that sounds to me like the first step that we would want to do to reduce the death rate and suffering of people.
Absolutely.
Again, you have to have knowledgeable practitioners. People just can't go out and take this drug on their own.
Sure. So, is DON the drug that you use in your pulsing technique?
Yeah, and it seems to be very powerful. It does the job that we want it to do. I think it could be doing the same thing in humans. Humans were treated with this drug alone in the past with mixed results, but at the same time, they were never targeting the glucose. So you're not going to do much with a drug that targets glutamine if you're not also targeting glucose. So again, once you realize what you have to do, it's not that complicated. And the technologies that we have available in the medical community today would be able to adapt this rapidly for application to people. The problem is that all of the oncology centers throughout the Western world are all linked into the same kinds of treatments, and it would be too much of a disruptive technology to say, we would want to do this or do that in lieu of what you're doing. And
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to get anybody that wants to do that, because you're putting another group of people out of business. So, one strategy is to say to people, okay, well, maybe we can use metabolic therapy together with whatever you think you want to do. And then, as I say, there's two roles for metabolic therapy. One is an attempt to target and eliminate the tumor cells, and the other is to try to minimize the toxicity of the other drugs and procedures that the patient is subjected to.
Yeah.
So, like in brain cancer, radiation therapy is in large part responsible for the rapid demise of the patients. So do you want to use? So you have to try to. What are we doing here? People say, well, we have to irradiate everybody, even though it's going to kill everybody. Well, not everybody, but just about everybody. Well, why are we doing that? Because we have to do it. I mean, you have to do it. That's the reason. Yeah, we must do that. Okay, so if we have to do that, then we have to have a therapy that will not only neutralize the massive toxicity from radiation therapy, but we also have to, at the same time, kill tumor cells non-toxically. So you're asking metabolic therapy to do a lot here. Yeah. In other words, avoid the horrific damage that radiation does to the brain, while at the same time trying to do what the radiation should have been doing in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a great temptation. Sorry, carry on.
That's a very hot button topic, what I just said here.
Okay.
As you can well imagine.
Totally. I can understand the picture that you're painting there. With these two fuels, glutamine and glycogen, and people, cancer sufferers particularly, are offered hope by the fact that they can sort of remove one leg of the stool, if you like, of the two main fuels. Is it rather like the body has the ability to burn fats or to burn glycogen? Does the cancer sort of tend to flip from one source of fuel to another, or is it continually sort of doing a little bit of mix of the two? Is there any information in there that can help people? And also, I mean, it is ultimately I'm getting is that really all people can do is lower their blood sugar in order to avail themselves to be in a position where they're going to be more likely to enjoy benefits of an approach like yours, your pulsing therapy.
Well, I mean, when you realize cancer cells use glucose and glutamine because their mitochondria respiration is defective. So when you look at tumor tissue cells, mostly in vivo, not from living tissue, from the patient's tissue, under the electron microscope, you invariably find abnormalities in the number, structure, and function of mitochondria. Structure dictates function. It's a tenet of biology. Mm-hmm. We can always know function based on structure, and we can predict function based on structure. So if the organelle that is responsible for generating energy and homeostasis is defective, this forces the cell to start to proliferate because it's falling back on ancient pathways that existed before oxygen came into the atmosphere. So basically, these cells are doing nothing more than fermenting, and that fermentation triggers them into a dysregulated cell growth. So in order to grow, they must have fermentable fuels because they can't get energy from oxygen. That's why they grow in hypoxic environments. Yep. That's why anti-angiogenic therapies are ultimately not going to work because the cell will grow in the absence of oxygen because it ferments. So then it becomes clear that what are the two prime fuels that allow the cell to ferment, and it's glucose and glutamine. So if I remove one of the fuels, they can fall back on the other fuel. Now, if I remove glucose, it becomes much more difficult for them to survive on glutamine, but they can survive. They only need tiny amounts of glucose in the presence of large amounts of glutamine, and vice versa. So the best strategy is if you get them both, then you've trapped them. Checkmate.
Got you.
And they can't switch to anything else. They can switch to other amino acids, but the problem is there's not sufficient quantity in and around in the tumor microenvironment to replace glucose and glutamine. There's not enough of these other fuels, so the tumor cell would use them up very quickly and then be compromised metabolically.
Right.
But yet many of the chemo and radiation therapies that we use free up massive amounts of glutamine in the microenvironment, which then allows these cells to be rescued. And many patients who are subjected to these horrifically toxic immunotherapies and all of these other chemotherapies are often given high-dose steroids to improve their appetite, which elevates the blood sugar.
Yeah.
So the very treatments that we give to the patients oftentimes put them in a state of compromise.
Sure.
Not everybody. Of course, you have a lot of cancer survivors. But, these people are pretty beat up from the treatments in most times.
Absolutely. Maybe, Professor, you could expand just a little bit upon your use of hyperbaric oxygen. I've had a couple of people contact me to say, could you elaborate a little bit more on what is hyperbaric oxygen treatment and how exactly does it help?
Well, the hyperbaric oxygen dissolves oxygen in the liquid of the cell. See, if you breathe 100% oxygen, all of the hemoglobin would be saturated with oxygen. But we're using oxygen. We want oxygen dissolved directly in the plasma, in the tissue microenvironment, in the fluids that surround cells. We want it, and therefore you have to breathe 100% oxygen under atmospheric pressure, 2 to 2.5 atmospheres, which then forces the oxygen to be dissolved in the serum. Now, the oxygen creates reactive oxygen species, which will kill cancer cells. Okay, so like for example, radiation therapy. If you irradiate tumors, the radiation beams hit molecular oxygen and cause this to become a radical, which then blows up, comes in close to the cancer cell and causes it to die from oxidative stress. We call it oxidative stress. But a lot of the tumors are in these hypoxic environments where there's no oxygen available or very little oxygen, and the radiation therefore does not do the job that it was supposed to do. So what we do is if we and the other thing too is the cells, if they ferment, that is, they use glucose and glutamine, those molecules will then make glutathione in the tumor cell, which is a powerful antioxidant system inside the tumor cell itself. So glucose provides glutathione through a pentose pathway, and glutamine makes glutamate, which is part of the glutathione. So glucose and glutamine provide the cancer cell with a powerful antioxidant system. So if we take away glucose and glutamine and then put the patient into hyperbaric oxygen, now the oxygen acts like radiation and can blow up and kill the tumor cells because they no longer have their protective shield. So it's a very simple, non-toxic way to do what radiation therapy does. In a sense, killing tumor cells through oxidative stress. But you first have to remove their protective shield against antioxidants, which is the lowering of the blood sugar and glutamine. Then they become super vulnerable, and they become vulnerable to therapies like hyperbaric oxygen. But if you don't put the patient in ketosis and target glucose and glutamine, then hyperbaric oxygen may not be as effective as it could be.
Great, thank you for that clarification. There's another question here which you kind of answered already, and I think it's kind of quite fundamental, really, and which is why I think you've answered it. But immunotherapy, you have sort of rubbished last time we chatted, and saying it's ineffective. And a lady writes in saying, or one of the listeners writes in, I do apologise if I'm not a lady, they just read about a new treatment called CAR/T, which they modify the number of your T cells or something and re-inject them. So is this all based on the fact that it's assuming that cancer is a genetic disease, or is this just again aiming at the wrong target? But perhaps you can just talk to that one.
Yeah, well, it's a combination of both. So it's called chimeric receptor antigen T, CAR-T. And basically, what it's trying to do is identify some of the epitopes on the surface of a cancer cell, and then collect the individual's T cells and genetically modify the T cells to go after that particular antigen.
Right.
It's a very complicated process because you have to take the person's T cells and ship them to California to have them genetically modified, and then they have to come back to the hospital, unless the hospitals can do the same thing that this place in California can do. And then you have to treat the patient with high dose chemo to kill all of his natural T cells, and then infuse these genetically modified T cells back into the patient. Now, here's the problem. Sometimes it works and it really does a good job, but sometimes it becomes too aggressive, leading to tumor lysis syndrome, massive cytotoxic release, which ends up killing the patient in a very short period of time. Or the genetically engineered T cells will start attacking other organs. Or immunotherapies, a different form of immunotherapies, could cause a hyperaggressive disease. Some of these immunotherapies elevate blood sugar. And another debilitating aspect is they cost like $300,000 or more to do something like this. I mean, most people can't afford this.
No.
Why would you want to do all of that? I call it Rube Goldberg, if you know who Rube Goldberg was.
I don't,
American cartoonist who developed extremely complicated ways to do something very simple. And you look on the web and you'll see Rube Goldberg, and you have to laugh at the way he would design these. They would call them Rube Goldberg machines. Extremely complicated ways to, pick up a newspaper on the front door, some of these kinds of things. So I look at the CAR T immunotherapies as Rube Goldberg machines, basically.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying.
I want to do that when all you have to do is target glucose and glutamine. I mean, not to say you can't do CAR T, not to say you can't do these things, but why would you want to?
Yeah.
If you understood the biology of the disease, you would never do that. It doesn't make any sense. So the people who are doing immunotherapies lack knowledge. They don't understand. They may know about immunotherapies, but they don't understand the biology of the disease they're treating. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing that. Now, that's another damning statement. But, the idea is go look at the data on the people who are being treated, see how many live and how many are killed. You should never ever treat anybody with a remote possibility that the therapy could kill the person or cripple or damage them. No. I don't know anybody who's died from metabolic therapy. So, I mean,
first do no harm, eh?
Well, that's been abused. But their idea is, well, we're going to try to save you, but there's an outside chance we could harm you.
Yeah.
And if you have nothing else, and nothing else is available or known, then maybe that's an okay excuse. But when you have an entirely new strategy that can achieve the same goal without harming the patient, and there's a strong scientific basis for that, what that is, then why would you not use it? So that comes back to the people who are never trained to know this, who know nothing about this.
Yeah.
So there you have to have a training period. You have to retrain the field to realize that cancer is a mitochondrial metabolic disease driven by glucose and glutamine. Yeah. Not that complicated.
Another listener asks that given that glutamine is food for cancer, does it mean that taking L-Glutamine supplements is unwise?
We don't know the answer to that. And we're even going to be trying that ourselves. So we want to try to give drugs that target and kill cancer cells that depend on glutamine, but also possibly give back L-Glutamine to enhance the vitality of the immune system. Okay. So that's a very good question, the answer about which we don't have yet. Okay. So we're working on those very experiments now.
Another listener writes in with, is the depression of the SHMT2 and SHMT1 enough to kill cancer cells? Can you comment on that? Now, I don't know what they mean by SHMT2. Are they two pathways?
I don't know. Sometimes we have so many acronyms
yes.
in the field that
that's an acronym too far.
An acronym could overlap with another, and then you end up, going around in a circle.
Okay. They maybe should have clarified that one a little better.
No, it looks like SMT is the somatic mutation theory.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what SMT1 and SMT2 are. We use SMT as an acronym for the somatic mutation theory.
Okay.
So unless they're talking about SMT1 being oncogenes and SMT2 being tumor suppressor genes, I mean, that's a guess that I could possibly. What was the question again?
It was what is the depression of SHMT2 and SHMT1 enough to kill cancer cells? Is the depression of both of those sufficient to kill cancer?
I'm thinking of. I didn't get the SHMT. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd have to have it spelled. I'd have to have it spelled out for me because we have so many. And listen, when you're looking at some of my papers, which I have a list of abbreviations. I mean, sometimes our list of abbreviations could be several paragraphs. And you can get all wound around. So it's best people write out the whole thing.
I couldn't agree more. Another lesson. Sorry to interrupt you there, Professor. Another listener contacted me with a concern about coffee when on a water fast. I think they'd heard something that coffee may in some way support cancer. Is that something that should be avoided on the water fast to combat cancer? I should have slotted that question in earlier, I think.
Yeah, well, that's a good question as well. I don't know. The purists would say caffeine, because caffeine has a tendency to increase glucocorticoids, which increase blood sugar. I say to the person, measure your glucose ketone index before caffeinated coffee and after caffeinated coffee, and see whether or not in your body the caffeine elevates blood sugar more than like if you took decaffeinated coffee versus caffeinated coffee. Do for a couple of weeks on the decaf, and then go to the caffeinated coffee and see what it does to your glucose ketone index. And if it jacks your index up, you might want to reconsider caffeinated beverage.
Is there any evidence that black coffee on a water fast can promote, if you like, autophagy? Is there any evidence that supports that idea?
I don't know. That I have no idea.
Okay. So thank you for dealing with that one. Another listener asks, can CBD oil help with cancer? I appreciate this might be slightly outside your remit.
Well, that's cannabinoids, I think.
Yes.
I think she's talking about the cannabinoid oil.
Yeah.
I really wanted to study that. But the problem is here we have so many government state regulations. It was a terrible thing. I tried to get I had to spend a lot of money for the license. By the time I got the license, the student that wanted to do the project had graduated. I let the license lapse, and then another student comes in and says, I want to do this cannabinoid study, and then I reapplied, and by the time I got the license, that student had disappeared. So it was just, we had to rig the lab up for break-ins by other students that might want and we had just a little drop in the bottle. It wasn't like we had a whole garden of cannabinoids. But it's a very good question. And what the idea is that cannabinoid oil increases basal metabolic rate. That's the rate at which your body burns energy. So if you do a therapeutic fast, because the people who do take cannabinoids sometimes get hungry, and they have the munchies, they call it, and they start eating because their basal metabolic rate goes up, and the body says, "Oh, we need more food." So here's the strategy. Now, can you imagine? Okay, how hard it is to stop eating for a week by just water only. How about cannabinoids with water only? Imagine how hungry you'd be. I mean, you'd be chewing wood.
Yeah, that'd be tickling the taste buds, wouldn't you? Just at an inopportune moment.
Oh my God! But just think the poor tumor cells, what they would be going through. So they potentially could be consumed for energy very quickly. So it's a very good question that needs to have a lot more further analysis under the guise of cancer as a metabolic disease, because I think there is good potential for that oil. I think you just have to use it again, like all these other things, in the right context. And then you could possibly have some therapeutic benefit. But you have to have people that are knowledgeable and have a good strategy as to why they would do that. And right now, again, we're back to the square one. We don't have people that understand cancer metabolism.
No, that does, again, we keep coming back to that being a primary goal, really, isn't it? To spread this message and get it out there. And understandably, I think a lot of listeners from our previous conversation are fired with optimism and an empowered sense that they can do something about their cancer conditions, because some of these questioners actually are obviously suffering with cancer. So they're obviously sort of clutching at straws. Well, not clutching at straws, reaching for a solution. And it sounds like you've identified the core of the solution, but unfortunately, there aren't enough of these oncologists out there yet to support people, even if the patient or the cancer sufferer is reasonably knowledgeable about what they require. There doesn't seem to be the education among the physicians.
Yeah, well, it's even deeper than that. Even if a physician were to be very interested and want to do this, the system would prevent them from doing it. So, this is even deeper than that, because some of these oncologists have been trained to do a certain procedure, and now you're asking them to change their procedure, but that would have to come from a higher up. It would have to come from the system itself. And if the system itself is locked into this mindless idea that cancer is a genetic disease, then you have the persistence of these particular kinds of things. And the latest rendition of this lack of knowledge is what I call the immunotherapies. They're just simply the latest in line of therapies that are not based on the biology of the disease. So, not to say they won't work for some people, they will, but it's not going to work for the majority of people. Too costly, too risky. So again, you have to retrain. You have to have the system. So the approach I find might be the best is the grassroots approach, things like you're doing right now, which could potentially cause a groundswell of a demand of change. It has to come, just like the current the problem in France right now with the yellow jacket people. You can talk all you want, but when you get the people running through the streets, turning cars over and burning, all of a sudden the president, Macron, all of a sudden said, we got to do something now. Right?
Absolutely.
So if you have cancer patients demanding an alternative approach to managing their disease, and they start rallying and marching, you'll get the results. There's no question about it. The problem, of course, again, in UK and the United States and around the world, all the cancer organizations are fragmented, because you have a breast cancer organization, you have brain cancer organizations, lung cancer organizations, and they're all fragmented. They're all the same disease. It just happens to affect lung, brain, or breast, or some other organ. But it's basically the exact or very, very similar kind of metabolism that underlies the commonality of these diseases. Yeah. So lung is not different from breast, is not different. They're all the same. They just happen to be affecting different organs. Yeah. So people say, well, I have to have a thing for breast cancer. Well, the therapy for breast cancer, and as a matter of fact, when you look at it, many of the traditional therapies for breast lung is radiation, right? They're using the same thing for the different. So, we would target all these cancers by targeting glucose and glutamine under different, it would be the same approach for the different cancers. Yeah. They're essentially trying to deprive them. So it's so unbelievable that, here's what I find: the layperson, the person not part of the community, understands this sometimes better than the oncologist does. Now that's another problem. How is it possible that the people that have the disease understand it better than the guy treating the disease?
Yeah, they haven't got to unlearn all that dogma first, have they?
Now, I don't think they have to unlearn it, because to relearn this other stuff is just is not that complicated. It's just that the procedures that they've been trained to do may no longer be applicable to the new form. So they would need to know how to train. And this would be they're practicing their art. I tell you, physicians know a lot about how people respond to different treatments. So for in the field of oncology, they would really be practicing their art in the best way, knowing each person as an individual entity. rather than giving them one pill fits all, with respect to slight deviations.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a much better outcome for a much greater number of people. And I look at the future as being very hopeful, but not when we keep going down the road of these other types of approaches that aren't related to the underlying mechanism responsible for the growth of the tumor.
No, we have to get fundamental, don't you? If you want to get to the root of the problem, you have to get to fundamental. And what I love about your work, and I can't over express my gratitude on behalf of so many people for picking up the ball from Otto Warburg and putting out this seemingly obvious truth. I mean, I'm a layperson, but I can look at evidence that you present, and it all seems to make perfect sense to me. That it's a far more rational and it's a hypothesis that makes far more sense when we look at cancer as a metabolic disease and not as a genetic disease. And I think one of the problems is that, out there in the mainstream, in what I refer to as the matrix on this show, a lot of people can't resist that predisposition to appeal to authority. And if the government says this and the big, cancer organization says that, then it must be true. And unfortunately, again, it's one of the themes of this show is to really point out that majority and authority don't actually necessarily have anything to do with the truth. And you've very clearly illustrated some of the problems we face, the institutional inertia and the downright resistance to change when people have trained in a therapy and that therapy is now going to maybe become obsolete. I mean, that's a disaster for that person. So it's all useful part of the picture, and thank you so much for contributing to this. I've got just one last question from a listener, because I realise we're pushing time, but is there any relevance, one listener asked me, to the NAD to NAD-h ratio, and is that something that we need to be concerned about in terms of cancer? Is that another acronym that you can make sense of?
Yeah, that's certainly the redox balance in the cell. I mean, obviously, everything is based on the redox balance, NAD plus ratio. Mm-hmm. So, when we're designing our therapies, we have to look at those ratios as well to keep, because don't forget, in cells that are respiring, NAD plus is generated in large amount by oxidative phosphorylation. But when that doesn't work, then you build up a lot of NADH and the ratio becomes very out of balance. So, and that's the reason why glutamine, in the use of glutamine for energy, that balance is being restored, but through a fermentation mechanism. And the same thing with glucose. Making massive amounts of lactic acid is reconfiguring NAD so that it can drive the glycolytic process, because if that ratios go too far out of balance, the system dies. Okay. So that's why we transition the body over to ketones, which is a good fuel for respiring cells, but a very poor fuel for fermenting cells. So part of the transition over to therapeutic ketosis is that we're allowing the maintenance of a good NAD/NADH ratio in the normal cells but also creating a massive imbalance in the tumor cells. So essentially, we're marginalizing the tumor and focusing in on their metabolic imbalances. Okay. And that's the strategy. Yeah. That's the way to do it. Not to incinerate the tissue or do those other kinds of things.
So is this NAD to NADH ratio improved or affected by the therapeutic ketogenic diet?
Well, it does. It improves it in normal cells, but throws it massively out of balance in the tumor cells. Great. So this is one of the reasons why. So when we take away the fermentable fuels, that balance falls apart. So you have very little NAD plus now. So you're really starving these tumor cells from a redox imbalance, and that's basically the underlying the problem here, and that's what the metabolic strategy is designed to do. So yes, I mean that's basically enhance the balance in normal cells, and increase the imbalance in tumor cells so that they can no longer generate energy.
Yeah, I think it's important for listeners to be aware of the instead of the maybe slight tendency to look at the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet as a silver bullet, as a sort of catch-all. This is all I can do, sort of thing. I think it's important to remember that there are so many benefits to the ketogenic diet through therapeutic ketosis, where you're effectively supporting your immune system. You're kicking into a much better metabolic state. So you're sort of you're really doing more than just one thing, aren't you? You're not just chipping away at a fuel for the cancer. You're also supporting your body in its ability to deal with it.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about metabolic therapy. You also manage many other imbalances in your body while at the same time degrading non-toxically your tumor cells. So type 2 diabetics improve significantly. All of these blood triglyceride elevations and cardiovascular problems, all of that is also at the same time targeted along with the tumor cells. So it's quite a phenomenon. It's quite a phenomenal kind of therapy. I mean, you could replace a lot of what we do today to people. In fact, you don't even need to have cancer to have the benefits of therapeutic ketosis. No, I mean, so treating cancer as a metabolic disease also will treat your diabetes and treat your cardiovascular disease and other inflammatory conditions.
Absolutely.
At the same time.
Yeah.
So this is potentially a very disruptive technology, actually.
Yeah, I love it. I love its its accessibility to the ordinary person, and also its wide-ranging health benefits, as you've just helped touch upon. And I think it's important for people to realise that it's not the be-all and end-all of a therapy. When people are talking about up-regulating, if you like, the preventative means, so cyclical ketogenic diet, or maybe the periodic fast that you've mentioned, 2, maybe 3 times a year, it's important to see that as it's not necessarily a catch-all. It's we do have to look more into these other therapies that you're working on, the what's it called, the press pulse technique, and we must all just work to spread the news and spread this information, which I believe is just so rationally it's just the only interpretation of the facts that makes sense. And I'd strongly recommend listeners who are interested to pick up a copy of Cancer as a Metabolic Disease by Professor Seyfried if they want to look into this and study it more. And we all need to try and apply pressure to broaden, the cancer research.
Yeah, well, it's happening slowly in this country and in other countries, in Australia, the UK, Germany, and other countries. People are starting to hear about this, and it has to come from the grassroots. It'll, in my mind, not likely ever come from the top medical institutions. Yeah. They're the last ones to actually, make the change. The bottom line is people want to live, and they want something that they can feel good about and not feel, traumatized by the very therapies used to treat them. I mean, I think as many people fear the treatments as much as they fear the disease.
Absolutely.
And it's not right to have that. And the bottom line is, if the governments and the health institutions are really, as you said, the authorities, then how do they explain the phenomenal rise every year in more cancer deaths? In the United States, it's over 1,600 people a day. In China, it's over 8,100 people a day. So, and in the UK, the incidence of brain cancer is going up extensively. I was there in September at a big meeting, Cancer Society meeting in London. People are concerned, rightly so, around the world. This is a problem that's not getting better; it's getting worse.
Absolutely. So the war on cancer is failing, isn't it?
Yeah, they're failing because they've misunderstood what the nature of the disease is. And as I said in my writings, the current worldwide cancer crisis is due in large part to the misunderstood belief that it's a genetic disease. And as long as it's considered a genetic disease, the kinds of therapies that are currently being developed are based along that track. And therefore, the outcome is going to be less than what people would have thought. So until we realize that it's a mitochondrial metabolic disease, I don't really see any major advances reducing the death rate worldwide. Once they come to realize, I will see a huge reduction in death rate, but it has to require a lot of changes on the part of a lot of systems and individual training.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Seyfried, for your part in getting this knowledge out, because it really is literally life-saving, particularly the preventative strategies, the idea of occasional water fasts. We know they're challenging, but, you know, wanting to continue living is a very powerful motivator. So, you know, maybe people could look into practicing a 1 week water fast a few times a year, 2 to 3, maybe more. There are certainly people such as Dr. McCullough who practice it once a month. I try and practice it a couple of, once every other month or so as well. So you've given us some useful tools. Particularly, you've given us some very crucial information in how to prevent cancer, and you might argue that this is more powerful information in order to prevent it. Preventing being I think a bigger goal in some respects than curing it, because once we know how to prevent it completely, then the need to cure it obviously by definition disappears. So thank you so much for helping to empower and share all of your knowledge, Professor Seyfried, on behalf of lots of cancer sufferers and people that want to prevent it. And is there anything that you'd like to add by way of closing statement, or to contact you or help support your work?
Well, I mean, our work is supported by private foundations mostly. The Foundation for Metabolic Therapy from Travis Christofferson, who wrote the book Tripping Over the Truth.
Indeed, yeah.
There's a George Yu Foundation also. You can see it on the web. They support research on metabolic therapies. And most of the money, almost every nickel of those monies, or every shilling, farthing, or whatever you want to call it, goes to the research, which is really quite good. Brilliant. So we have those kinds of supports, and as long as we're able to do the preclinical studies to validate the things that we're talking about, the more that it gets out into the mainstream in the clinics, and they start applying it to the patients. Wow. So that's the way it works. But anyway, thank you for your attention, and I think folks like you are the guys that are actually bringing the word out to more people. The podcasts that I do and people that have general interest around the world, they're spreading and they're learning more about this. And eventually it has to, because we can't continue to do what we're doing. So Absolutely. It will change.
Absolutely. The truth does out, doesn't it? Well, thank you so much, Professor Seyfried. And thank you to all of you who contacted me with the questions and as a result of our previous chat. Thank you very much for listening. I would urge you to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's lots more there about trying to rationally arrive at truth so that we can thrive. And we know that we've got our work cut out pushing against the mainstream message, as Professor Seyfried has given us further proof today. I do hope you've enjoyed the show, and I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be